Dynasty Warriors is a series I have a real long-standing attachment to. One that stands in stark contrast to how little I've talked about it on this show. This was one of the first history-inspired video games I ever played, back when I had saved up enough money to buy a used copy of Dynasty Warriors 4 that I'm genuinely surprised still works, despite the disc being covered in a myriad of scratches that I'd rather not know the origin of. This franchise has become quite well known for its large cast of playable characters known as officers, who were modeled after famous soldiers, nobles, strategists, and more from the time period of 2nd and 3rd century China. While the focus of the Dynasty Warriors series is expectedly placed upon the three kingdoms of Shu, Wu, and Wei, as well as the Jin faction when Dynasty Warriors 7 expanded the timeline, there also exists another category of playable characters, those who don't have a particularly strong affiliation to any of the technically four kingdoms, simply referred to as the Other faction. Quite honestly, the Other faction is my favorite in Dynasty Warriors cast. Even though it's meant to contain characters that only play smaller roles in the grander picture of the era, these characters still have fascinating stories of their own. Case in point, you needn't look further than Yuan Shao. I feel like I'm in a pretty small minority that actually likes Yuan Shao's portrayal in Dynasty Warriors, though I can definitely see why most others aren't particularly fond of him. As the mainline Dynasty Warriors games have gotten progressively more serious and dramatic, Yuan Shao has, ironically, gotten sillier, having evolved from an ill-fated and old-fashioned commander to a pretentious and foppish foil to Cao Cao. With all the exaggerated emphasis on his noble background, especially in contrast to his previous attitude as a doomed traditionalist, you have to wonder how his portrayal in Dynasty Warriors compares to history, and that's exactly what I intend to do in the next several minutes. Hopefully this shouldn't be too difficult to explain, as things are going to get a bit complicated. I'm the Kitsune Hawk, and today we're going to once again dive headfirst into the last decades of the Han Dynasty, this time to see how the rise and fall of the prestigious Yuan Shao is reflected in Koei Tecmo's Dynasty Warriors series. So get out your pencils, trivia enthusiasts, because this is character development. As the introduction suggested, today's episode will have to begin with a bit of clarification, because I had to take some additional time with the research for this episode, and even then, I'm not 100% certain I was able to make the best connections and conclusions with Dynasty Warriors' portrayal of Yuan Shao. Early Chinese history is always a bit tricky to talk about, because elements of folklore and religion have long been intertwined with historical narrative, and Dynasty Warriors is certainly no exception to this rule. The franchise has always taken a considerable amount of inspiration from Luo Guanzhong's Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a classical Chinese novel that blended records of the Three Kingdoms era with heroic legends and epic drama, and was originally published over a millennium after the actual history. That being said, Yuan Shao's window of prominence in the historical time frame is closely associated with the circumstances that get the Three Kingdoms era as a whole rolling, so we need to start from the beginning. The Han Dynasty, which began in 202 BCE, was one of many golden ages in Chinese history, and one that had a profound effect on shaping the identity of the region, a legacy which continues to this very day. Advances in economics, science, philosophy, international trade, cartography, military technology, and many other fields characterized just how prosperous China was under the rule of the Han emperors. But, like everything else in this entropic existence, the Han Dynasty was not perfect, and its eventual decline would be a messy affair. Most relevant to our story today is that, starting in the 1st century CE, groups of eunuchs in the Han imperial court began to force themselves into positions of greater authority, undermining the power of the emperor in the process. By the second half of the 2nd century CE, further problems began to emerge for the Han administration, starting with a series of droughts and floods that damaged and displaced large numbers of China's agrarian workforce. This, combined with the excessive taxation of the masses and the further weakening of the emperor, contributed to a rise in radical Taoist sects that rallied the Chinese populace against the Han government, which they claimed had clearly lost the mandate of heaven and thus needed to be overthrown. Chief among these Taoist movements were the Yellow Turbans, also known as the Yellow Scarves or the Way of Peace, and the Way of the Five Pecks of Rice, also known as the Way of the Celestial Masters. Because of the clear threat that these religious groups posed to China's already unstable situation, Emperor Ling appointed his relative He Jin to lead a military force against the Yellow Turbans when their rebellion broke out across China in 184 CE. Among He Jin's allies was Yuan Shao, a descendant of the high-ranking Yuan family, which had served the Han Emperor as the Excellency of Works for 4 generations, among other equally esteemed noble titles. With the military assistance of Yuan Shao and many other commanders, He Jin and the Imperial forces crushed the Yellow Turbans by 185 CE, and their revolt against the Han government quieted down with the death of their leader, Yuan Shao. Fear not though, Yellow Turban apologists, because they stick around for another 20 years or so, just very unorganized. But the elimination of the Yellow Turbans wasn't the end goal for Yuan Shao and He Jin. The two generals had a shared ambition of restoring the authority of the Emperor, and that meant getting rid of the faction of court eunuchs known as the Ten Attendants. In 189, Emperor Ling died from illness, but his chosen successor, Liu Bian, or more formally Emperor Shao, was only 13 at the time. So He Jin, as the official general-in-chief, was appointed as a regent to partially rule over China until the emperor was properly old enough. This gave He Jin a great deal of leverage to use against the eunuchs, since the Ten Attendants opposed the nomination of Liu Bian and, as a result, no longer had their base of reliable military support. With the advice of Yuan Shao, He Jin invited a group of military leaders led by Dong Zhuo to the imperial capital of Luoyang, hoping to place pressure on the Empress Dowager, who had been a protector of the eunuchs. Having learned of the growing plot against them, the Ten Attendants lured He Jin into the imperial palace by forging an invitation from the Empress. Despite He Jin being warned by Yuan Shao not to enter the palace alone, he did it anyway. Shockingly, it was an ambush, and the eunuchs promptly murdered He Jin on charges of treason. After the general's severed head was then thrown outside, the military forces of Yuan Shao, his half-brother and cousin Yuan Shu, and Dong Zhuo all retaliated, storming into the imperial palace and massacring most of the troublesome eunuchs as well as any man that so much as looked like a potential eunuch. But as aggressive as this altercation was, it once again failed to remedy the power vacuum in China. Dong Zhuo stepped in and took control of the imperial court, securing his authority by propping Liu Bian's 8-year-old brother as a new puppet emperor, thus ensuring himself a long period of regency. After escaping from Luoyang, Yuan Shao and Yuan Shu organized a coalition of powerful lords from across China to depose Dong Zhuo and properly restore the authority of the Han Emperor. Included in this coalition was Cao Cao, a lower-ranking nobleman and childhood friend of Yuan Shao, though neither man knew at the time that their ideologies would be in direct conflict with each other in the not-too-distant future. Throughout 190 CE, the coalition fought against Dong Zhuo's loyalists, but the Union of Nobles quickly weakened and was effectively dissolved by the end of the following year. Dong Zhuo was killed by his own adopted son Lu Bu in 192, and by that point, the focus had shifted away from restoring the emperor and toward aggregating regional authority, with the intent of winning the emperor's favor and/or seizing the throne. Yuan Shao was one of the many nobles expanding his influence, having taken control of Ji province from Han Fu in 191 and expanding across northern China between 192 and 196, following successful campaigns against Gongsun Zan and Kong Rong. By 198 CE, Yuan Shao and his family were in control of all 4 provinces north of the Yellow River, but not without a few blunders that effectively doomed his ambitions. The most critical of these mistakes occurred in 195, when a group of Yuan Shao's advisors suggested that he arrange a ceremonial welcome for Emperor Xian, which would bestow the Yuan family with a great amount of prestige and possibly allow them to become the new influencers of the Han government. Yuan Shao, who had been a stalwart defender of the Han Emperor, bizarrely hesitated on his answer. Much of this indecisiveness came from Yuan Shao not wanting to sacrifice his existing autonomy, having been cautioned of such a consequence by 2 of his other advisors. As a result, Emperor Xian instead visited the land directly southward, which was under the control of Yuan Shao's former friend and ally turned newfound rival, Cao Cao. Because of this invitation, Cao Cao's capital at Xuchang became the new imperial capital of China in 196 CE, and the Cao family, not the Yuan, became a powerful influence within the Han court. Cao Cao even began issuing imperial orders in the emperor's name, one of which was a censure of Yuan Shao's rising power and territory, though he was also granted the distinguished title of General-in-Chief. Nevertheless, Yuan Shao recognized Cao Cao as a major threat that needed to be dealt with. Both lords had built up a sizable base of power on opposite sides of the Yellow River, and conflict was inevitable, but the question was, when? After resolving his war with Gongsun Zan, further consolidating his power in northern China, and granting asylum to a certain Liu Bei, Yuan Shao declared war on Cao Cao in 200 CE. The ensuing battle would take place near Guandu, located along the Yellow River between Cao Cao's capital of Xuchang and Yuan Shao's military headquarters at Ye, and it would be this one campaign that showcased the rest of Yuan Shao's fatal errors. Yuan Shao's army had a definite numerical advantage, with 110,000 soldiers fighting against Cao Cao's forces, which numbered around 40,000. Though the Yuan forces were still war-weary from fighting against Gongsun Zan, and initial failed skirmishes proved that Yuan Shao's greater numbers didn't hold their full force of intimidation. What truly doomed Yuan Shao, though, was food. Cao Cao's army, largely holed up inside Guandu fortress, began to run low on rations as the battle continued. But the Yuan army had an even greater weakness. They had extended their supply line the further they traveled southward. Cao Cao, with the advice of his strategists Shen Yu, Jia Shu, and Xu Yu, ordered 2 strategic fire attacks during the Guandu campaign. One on the nearby town of Gusha, where the Yuan army was hiding grain, and another on Wuchao, where Yuan Shao's supply line was delivering, but hardly defending. Both attacks were a tremendous success. The Yuan army and its morale collapsed from starvation, more officers surrendered or defected, and Cao Cao's forces routed what remained of the Yuan army, claiming to have killed at least 70,000 men across the entire campaign. A follow-up battle occurred at Kongting the next year, eliminating the rest of the Yuan army south of the Yellow River and further proving that Yuan Shao's hubris had truly cost him everything in just one battle. Yuan Shao became severely ill from the grief of his loss, dying in 202 CE and leaving his lands in disarray over succession, an easy position for Cao Cao to come along and annex them, thus securing his northern border, though while he was there, Cao Cao also made time to pay his respects at the tomb of his old friend. And with that bit of poetic resolution, that covers the rather complicated record of Yuan Shao and his role in the conflict at large, allowing us to see why he is the way he is in the Dynasty Warriors series. As I mentioned earlier, Yuan Shao's portrayal very clearly evolved over the course of the series, with Dynasty Warriors 6 being the visible turning point. At the same time, though, he's also been consistently defined as a foil to Cao Cao, given their historical relationship of friends turned rivals. It's just become more overt in recent titles than it was in the classic entries. For the intents and purposes of today's analysis, I'll start with the old, then move on to the new, and conclude with a couple of more general points. Between his first appearance in Dynasty Warriors 2 in 2000 and Dynasty Warriors 5 in 2005, Yuan Shao was characterized as an honor-bound nobleman proud of his heritage, but he's also noticeably old-fashioned, with his stubbornness for the long-gone halcyon days of the Han becoming his hubris over the course of the story. Much like history, Yuan Shao falls to Cao Cao because of how fixated he is on sticking to traditional methods and restoring the old state of the Han, rather than adapting to the changing landscape of China and working to create a new state like the leaders of the Three Kingdoms did. His design remained fairly consistent throughout his early appearances, featuring a full and fairly traditional suit of armor, elaborately decorated to suit his high standing, and very noticeably yellow in color for a similar reason. To be more specific, Yuan Shao and his army as a whole have been color-coded as golden yellow throughout the franchise, most likely because yellow is strongly associated with prestige, prosperity, and royalty within traditional Chinese culture. For someone with a lineage and connection to the Han imperial court like Yuan Shao, it makes perfect sense for his army to use yellow as their standard. The original 2007 release of Dynasty Warriors 6 brought with it a drastic new direction for the series' character designs and personalities, and Yuan Shao is definitely one of the most extreme cases, one that, as of Dynasty Warriors 9, remains his regular characterization. Yuan Shao's pride in his distinguished lineage has been exaggerated to a less intimidating and more comedic degree, where he feels the need to regularly remind everyone around him that he is, in fact, blue-blooded. In place of his old-fashioned honor is a more pretentious and holier-than-thou attitude. The idea that his nobility alone can somehow inspire he and his allies to success. A far, or rather further, cry from Cao Cao's serious demeanor and pragmatic methodology. It's a thing of beauty, Yuan Shao out here with more ham than a supermarket delicatessen. Zhang Jiao would be proud. To further reinforce this more extreme shift in character, Yuan Shao's recent designs have incorporated a number of European elements. What with all the cravats, collars, coats, and carefully cut facial hair, collectively evoking the image of a classic self-absorbed dandy. Dynasty Warriors 7 even went the extra mile and swapped out his usual sword for a very Western alternative, a rapier. While I'm on this topic, I have to say, I really like how Yuan Shao's newer designs have also given him grayed hair, since, historically, he was somewhere around 13 years older than Cao Cao. To put that into perspective, Yuan Shao was already in his 40s at the time of the Yellow Turban Rebellion, and was almost in his 60s at Guandu. Part of me also wants to think that it might have been done to further visualize his traditional attitudes and old prestige as a direct opposite of the younger Cao Cao's craftiness and new ambitions. His design in Dynasty Warriors 9 is also noteworthy, effectively balancing elements of both his classic and modern designs while still looking distinct from Cao Cao's darker-colored but still high-ranking appearance. Further evidence of the two lords' ideological contrast can be seen with some of Cao Cao and Yuan Shao's weapons. Between Dynasty Warriors 3 and Dynasty Warriors 5, both characters' weapon sets were given names themed after their background and principles of rule. Cao Cao's four blades, the Broadsword, General Sword, Sword of Heaven, and Wrath of Heaven, all reinforce the idea of a man of talent and ambition rising into power. On the other hand, Yuan Shao's four blades, the Noble Sword, Regal Sword, Sword of Honor, and Sword of Kings, all reinforce an image of tradition and power from birth. Now that the modern Dynasty Warriors games have turned the weapon sets into something any character can use, this element of character symbolism has unfortunately been lost. Lastly, let's talk about the battles themselves. Unsurprisingly, the Dynasty Warriors games that include a story mode of some manner for Yuan Shao and his army tend to emphasize the Guandu campaign as the main focal point, usually as the lone or final battle to conclude Yuan Shao's clash of ideology with Cao Cao. Those that include multiple stages, such as Dynasty Warriors 5 and Dynasty Warriors 9, build up to the Guandu campaign by including battles based on Yuan Shao's leadership of the coalition against Dongzhuo, as well as sections of his campaigns to secure the northernmost provinces of China. Dynasty Warriors 3 Extreme Legends and Dynasty Warriors 4 even go beyond Guandu, with the victorious Yuan forming as one of the three kingdoms instead of Wei, and then embarking on separate campaigns against the forces of Wu and Shu to triumphantly unite China under their golden banner. I doubt it could have ever happened this easily in real life, but hey, it's still a fun bit of alternate history. And that should be a good place to stop. I'm pretty sure I might have gone overboard with today's discussion. I know a number of fans don't like Yuan Shao's redesign since Dynasty Warriors 6, but if you ask me, I think it helped him stand out more among the increasingly large and colorful cast. Even in its early days, Dynasty Warriors wasn't without its sillier moments and caricatured officers, and both the old and new versions of Yuan Shao are still fairly accurate in their own ways. While the historical Yuan Shao had the intent of restoring the status quo of the Han Dynasty, it was his noble birth that also made him conceited and blind to the fact that the Han was already on its way out during his lifetime. Reaching out for faded glory was incompatible with the rise of new powers and dynasties, and in the end, all it took was one failed campaign against Cao Cao for that idea to crumble. Depending on how you look at it, Yuan Shao was either a tragically doomed idealist, as best seen in the classic Dynasty Warriors games, or a stubborn obstacle to progress, as best seen in the modern Dynasty Warriors games. Just goes to show that perhaps there can be more to a character than a first impression might convey. Or maybe I'm just biased because I've always had a soft spot for Yuan Shao, both old and new.